Alright, y'all, so we are back here looking at chapter 8. So let's take a look. So, here we go, y'all. Chapter 8. Well, actually, what we begin here is we start looking at a new section, if you will. And, y'all, the section doesn't matter anything at all as far as, like, testing-wise or anything like that. So, it's just kind of way the book kind of breaks things up. But the new national period, again, talking about, look, we went through that space where we were discovering America. Then we became the British colonies, and then we gained our independence, and we went through the Articles of Confederation. And now we move forward and we look at that idea of adopting the Constitution as kind of like a separation point, if you will. It's a defining marker. And here we start the new national period. Okay. But chapter 8 is going to be called the Federalist Era. Okay. We're going to see the rise of political parties. Again, now we are shifting away from that Federalist, Anti-Federalist, into what we will see as the creation of political parties. But we'll get to that in a minute. So, as we look here at chapter 8, couple of general notions, couple of general statements, right? The U.S., what was the United States at that time, is going to be from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River, basically everything from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River, right? Not counting, and from Florida up to the Great Lakes, from Florida up to Canada. So Atlantic to the Mississippi, from Canada down to Florida. Okay. So what are we looking at? It has almost 4 million people. Most of those were rural residents. There were very few cities that had more than 5,000 people. So 4 million people, most of them are rural. Most of your cities don't even have more than 5,000 people. Yo, and again, put that in context. Think about here we are at Nicholls State, and our student population is going to be, between some hovering somewhere between 5 and 7,000. So very few cities in America at this time were larger than Nicholls. Okay, so again, just trying to put those things in context. We also have to understand that most African Americans were living in the South under terms of enslavement. Most African Americans in America at this time were enslaved. But there were some free blacks. There were African Americans or black Americans who were free at this point in time. And actually, the ratio of free black to enslaved black was the highest ever. And what I mean by that is the gap. So, think about it as for every one free black, we had 2 slaves at that point in time. And y'all, I'm just making up numbers, okay? But later on, as we move further and further down the line, it'll be for every one free black, we have 5 enslaved people. And for every one free black, we have 15 enslaved people, right? So the gap here is the smallest. Highest ratio, smallest gap, okay? We also see that the first census is going to be taken in 1790. This was stated in the Constitution to be done every 10 years. Why do we do the census every 10 years? Why do we count the people? Remember, we determined back with things like the Great Compromise that part of representation in this new government would be based upon population. Well, if it's based on population, we got to know what the population is. So we have to count them. So again, first census is going to be taken in 1790 because it was stated to be taken every 10 years according to the Constitution. Okay. We see that the South is going to turn to cotton. 1793, Eli Whitney is going to invent the cotton gin. Whether he invented it or somebody else did, and he kind of just gets the credit for it, that's there. But nonetheless, Eli Whitney is credited with inventing the cotton gin in 1793. At that point in time, y'all, the South turns to cotton, and they lean really heavily on cotton. You also see that the middle states are going to be very diverse in both the people and business. They have a good balance between agriculture and commerce. Then we see that the New England states start to explore manufacturing a little bit more, even though they're not counted as well. We see the New England states start to explore manufacturing more. So the South is farming, the middle colonies are mixed, and then New England is going to be largely commerce and manufacturing, right? Now we also have Native Americans, right? Even though the Native Americans are not going to be counted in the census, we still have numerous Native Americans in the U.S. territories, especially in what we will call the Old Northwest, what for these Americans is the Northwest. Again, think Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, that region of the country. That was the Northwest to them. Remember, now the border of the country is with Canada, so the Great Lakes in Canada. So around the Great Lakes, that's the northern border. The Mississippi River is the western border, so Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, that's the Northwest for these people. So we see a lot of Native Americans there, and in the South, and all of these are going to resist American encroachment with the help of the Europeans. So remember, the Spanish control west of the Mississippi River and the Florida territory. So any Americans who are trying to go west or go further south are going to run into not only Native Americans, but Spanish who are helping them. Any Americans who are trying to go north or west might encounter Spanish, Native Americans, and British. Okay, remember the British had a lot of forts in these regions, so the British still have some of their forts in what Americans consider American territory. So we see a lot of conflicts that are going to happen there. So regardless, all the Native Americans are going to push back against the Americans. And then you have the Europeans, the Spanish or the British, who are going to help them at times. So again, especially in the old Northwest and the South, they resisted American encroachment, and they're helped by the Europeans like the British and the Spanish. This is going to cause real problems later on as the Americans start to increase their population west of the Appalachian Mountains. So remember, we had that proclamation of 1763 when we were under the British that said, look, don't go past the mountains. Well, now that Americans control everything, they go wherever they want. As more and more people go west of the Appalachian Mountains, we're going to start to see more and more conflicts with the Native Americans in those regions. Okay, and just a quick aside for a moment, going back to Eli Whitney. We'll talk about this later, but I just kind of want to mention it here. The invention of the cotton gin is one of those things that I love to point out the thought of unintended consequences, right? Paying attention to the idea that no matter what we do, we can almost never plan for the unintended, right? So Eli Whitney develops the cotton gin, ultimately trying to make the production of cotton easier. Make it easier, make it quicker, whatever. Okay, well that's great. But what's an unintended consequence of it? An unintended consequence of the cotton gin. Something Eli Whitney did not intend to do, but his invention ultimately leads to it, is actually an increase in slavery. We see that, oh, well, it's easier to produce this cotton. Well, that means the planters, the farmers, want to have more cotton because they want to make more money. So what do I need if I need more? If I can produce the cotton quicker, I need to grow more cotton. Well, what do I need to grow more cotton? I need more workers, aka I need more slaves. So we see these unintended consequences that are important. And so Eli Whitney developed something to make cotton production easier. Ultimately, we'll see that it will also increase the use of slavery in the American South. But we move on. So when we finished up chapter 7, we were talking about how the Articles of Confederation was fading away, and we're beginning with the new constitutional government. So let's look at it. In New York City in 1789, Congress certified that George Washington was elected by the Electoral College. Okay? So George Washington wins the first presidential election. He had 69 votes, and in second place was John Adams with 34. So Washington has a pretty substantial victory. But what's interesting is that John Adams comes in second place. Okay, whatever. What's the big deal? The big deal is that now John Adams is vice president. The way the Constitution was originally written was that whoever came in first place was president, and whoever came in second was vice president. Y'all, imagine, they will quickly realize, it won't take them long to realize that that's going to be a problem. But could you imagine if we lived in that scenario today? Could you imagine where, go back to the election of 2016, or as we approach the elections of 2020, could you imagine a scenario where somebody wins and the other one is their vice president? How would that government work out? That's one thing that they kind of missed. They kind of missed this idea. And again, the reason why is because at this point in time, they don't have political parties. So you think, well, how could you ever believe that that would work? Well, at this point in time, they don't have political parties. Once we get the evolution of political parties, they will quickly change this. But nonetheless, by law, John Adams became vice president because he came in second. Then, on a balcony overlooking Wall Street, remember the capital is in New York City. So on a balcony overlooking Wall Street, George Washington took the oath of office. What office, though? What was he supposed to be called? The Constitution doesn't say, the Constitution doesn't talk about a president. The Constitution talks about the executive and the executive branch. It doesn't mention the term president. So what do we call? What do we call George Washington? I mean, he's not a king, but he needs a title that gives him respect. So what do? One of the first debates in Congress is actually a really long debate about what to call or what title George Washington should have. And it seems kind of trivial, it seems kind of unimportant, but y'all, to them it was. Remember, these are people who fought a war to get rid of a king. Okay? These are people who fought a war to get rid of a king, and it really means something to them. They literally just fought a war, not that long ago, to get rid of King George III. If they make George Washington king, then he's King George. Like, they don't want that. They really don't want that, and it means something to them. And again, we see those things. We all have those moments in lives where, like, that might not mean much to you, but it means the world to me. And to these people, what they would call George Washington really mattered. And I love to tell this story too. They'll finally settle on the title of the president. But what's funny is that John Adams, as vice president, was the leader, or was the overseer of the Senate. He didn't really do a whole lot. He's president of the Senate, but like, he's just kind of, he's there, right? He's overseeing, and his job was to break ties if they had him. But John Adams' suggestion, and it's one of those times when, like, I've told you this before, I really love to study John Adams, and I think he's really good in a lot of aspects. This is one point, and we'll talk about a lot of his stuff here in chapter 8. But this is one of the points where, like, he was just off base. John Adams came up with this title: His Highness, the President of the United States of America and Protector of the Rights of the Same. That's a really long title. Ultimately, George Washington kind of settles this debate and says, "Call me the President," and that's it. If you ever get a chance to watch the HBO miniseries called John Adams, they kind of do a good showing of this, where George Washington kind of says, "Just call me the president," and he looks at John Adams and says, "And only the president," because Washington doesn't want this big title, he doesn't want this big to do. It's a position, it's something there, but he doesn't want the pomp and circumstance of it. But nonetheless, it's a big debate, and ultimately they settle on the title of the president. But who are the people that are going to help the president? The cabinet, right? Every president has a cabinet. They are the close advisors, right? The people who lead different departments of the executive branch. So we need the cabinet. Congress used the offices that had been set under the Articles of Confederation because they made sense. Okay, so what are those offices? Thomas Jefferson was the first Secretary of State. Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of Treasury. Henry Knox, Knox, Henry Knox was the first Secretary of War. So these are positions that had been established under the Articles of Confederation. They look around like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Let's reuse those. Okay, we'll see Edmund Randolph, who becomes the first Attorney General. And then we see John Jay will be appointed as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now those last two positions, Edmund Randolph as Attorney General and John Jay as Chief Justice, those are not created right away. Those will be created by the Judiciary Act of 1789. That created the federal court system. So the Judiciary Act of 1789 created the federal court system and created those two positions, Attorney General and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Okay, the Attorney General is considered part of the cabinet. John Jay as Chief Justice is not. John Jay is a part of the judicial branch, but both of those positions were created by the Judiciary Act of 1789. Now, the next thing we need to pay attention to here as well is how do we get the Constitution passed? How did the Federalists get the Anti-Federalists to agree to it? They promised them a Bill of Rights. So we have that promise about some Bill of Rights for, the rights for the people and for the states. So remember, the Constitution protected the national government. What about the people? What about the states? Some states only ratified the Constitution because of a promise of the Bill of Rights. Ultimately, what do we call the Bill of Rights? The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Okay. Um, and those first 10 amendments established the rights of the people and the states. Okay. Now I'm gonna pause just for a second. So yeah, I have this really cool little poster here in my office, and yeah, you can see some artwork from my children there on the right. But I have this really cool poster that I've always really liked. I found it, and it is the periodic table of the amendments. If you paid attention to things back in high school where you learned about the periodic table of the elements, well, I have this poster that they did, periodic table of the amendments. I also have another one right there, periodic table of the presidents. But this one kind of shows and it breaks the amendments down by groups. So we have the Bill of Rights, then we'll have 11 and 12, then 13, 14, and 15 are Civil War amendments. So I show you that because I find that stuff to be ultimately really interesting. And when we talk about the Bill of Rights, I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm not going to go each one by one, but I want to talk about a few of them. Okay. So again, the Bill of Rights is going to be the first 10 amendments and establish the rights of the people and the states. The First Amendment gave the right to free speech and religion, among other things. Freedom of expression is how it's often referred to, right? There's like the 5 freedoms, right? Free speech, religion, press, petition, and assembly. So it gave the right to free speech, free religion, among other things. Basically, it gave the people a voice. Then the Second Amendment gave the right to bear arms. In case the government needed to be changed or they needed to fight as a militia. So the Second Amendment, again, something very hotly debated here in America today. But it gave the right to bear arms. Again, these are people who, this was founded by, these were written by people who helped start a revolution, who took up arms to change their government. So they believed that that was important. And so they had it there. Now, do we want to talk about changes in context and different things? Yes, though we can always look at those. But that's how they felt at this time. Then I'm going to skip down to the 10th Amendment, y'all. The 10th Amendment said powers not given to the federal government are reserved for the states. This is going to be a big deal later on when we get to Civil War, and we're going to see it come up a couple other times. We'll talk about it a little bit more here in Chapter 8. But the 10th Amendment, again, said the powers not given to the federal government are reserved for the states. It's going to be a big deal as we move forward. Talk about it in a little while, and again, we'll talk about it some more, especially when we talk about the Civil War. Okay, so that's the constitutional government kind of getting some things set up, kind of finishing off like setting up the government. Constitution set it up. These are our last little things that we kind of the finishing touches, right? So now we move on to Hamilton's America. Huh? What? Understand this, y'all. George Washington is president. Hamilton is his Secretary of Treasury. And Hamilton is going to be one of George Washington's closest advisors. Okay, so let's look at who is Hamilton. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the Broadway play about Hamilton, but let's take a look at it, y'all. Hamilton was a child born out of wedlock on a Caribbean island, and he later came to the United States. He entered the army, became Washington's aide. So in the Revolutionary War, Hamilton is one of Washington's aides, and he becomes a trusted advisor, right? After the war, he went to law school, set up his own practice, so this is ultimately a successful person. Now, Hamilton here is going to become the Secretary of Treasury again, and he's a very trusted advisor to Washington. Hamilton will become known as the father of the national debt. And if I tell you that, y'all, you think, oh, well, who wants to be known as the father of the national debt? At that time, it's not really a horrible thing, y'all. Debt at that point in time was not the, unbelievable number that we think of today in American society. But here's the thing: Hamilton becomes known as the father of the national debt, but that's not a bad thing because he's really a smart guy, and he actually has a plan. He has a plan, and he talks about that plan in this thing that he writes called the Reports on Public Credit. In the Reports on Public Credit, he outlined his ideas. Simply put, his ideas that he puts forth on the Reports on Public Credit are to assume all of the state debts from the Revolutionary War. And how is going into debt going to be a good thing? You always hear that, y'all. Avoid debt. Don't go into debt. Avoid it if you can help it. So why is Hamilton wanting to go into debt? It's a couple things, okay? He knew the government needed to get stronger. Remember, y'all, we saw the Articles of Confederation. Super weak government. He comes in and he says this constitutional government needs to be stronger. So he knew the government needed to be stronger, and he believed the national debt would do that in two ways. Okay, first of all, the taxes. If we have debt, if the U.S. government has debt, how is it going to pay? It's going to charge the people, it's going to charge the citizens taxes. So, the taxes used to pay the debt would show the power of the government to its citizens. If the government forces citizens to pay taxes, that shows the strength of the government, at least to a certain degree. Okay? And then secondly, repaying the loans, repaying those debts in a timely fashion would help us in international relations. So think about it like this. Is anybody, as a high school freshman, is anybody going to walk up and loan you money? No. Nobody, like no bank is going to go out there and say, well, you don't have any way to pay this back. You don't have a job. You don't do this, right? And so if you can't borrow money, it's kind of hard to do anything. It's kind of hard to start a business or do that or yada, yada, yada. Okay, so what happens? Hamilton says, look, I want to assume all of the state debts. Okay? What Hamilton wanted to do was he wanted to take all the debt that each individual state of Virginia, state of New York, state of Massachusetts, that they had acquired during the Revolutionary War, and say, look, states, you don't have to pay that. We, the U.S. government, will pay it. The U.S. government would assume all of those debts, and then the U.S. government would make those payments to France, or to Spain, or to whatever country that the money was owed. The point of that is to do what? Show the power of the government over the people. Remember, Articles of Confederation couldn't force people to pay taxes. Like they could only request money. Here, the constitutional government is going to say, you owe us taxes, pay up. So it shows the power of the government to its citizens, and then because the U.S. government would pay that money to France or Spain or to whoever else they owe, it would help develop a better relationship. Remember, under Articles of Confederation, even France, who was our friend, we didn't have a good relationship with because we owed them money. So all of these things are going to come into play. Now, that plan doesn't make everyone happy, especially the South. Many southern states had already paid off their debt, and they didn't want to help the northern states. Again, if all of you owe $25 to me, and then half of you paid me but the other half didn't, do you want a new plan that all of a sudden says, okay, well, 10 people paid me, 10 people didn't, so the 10 people who didn't pay me, that's $250. All of you, all 20 of you are now going to pay that $250. Like, the South is like, we already paid our debt. We don't want to help the North pay theirs. So this plan doesn't make everyone happy because many of the southern states had already paid off their debts and didn't want to have to help the northern states. This leads to the Compromise of 1790. So how do you get the South to agree to help pay this debt? The federal government gets the debt. That's the deal. The federal government would take this debt, but the permanent federal capital would be in the South along the Potomac River. So now they say, excuse me, South, if you help us pay the debt for the North, we will make the new national capital in the South. We have this spot picked out along the Potomac River, so what ultimately becomes Washington, D.C. Remember, at this point in time, the national government is in New York City, but now they're saying they'll move it to the South, move it to Virginia, this area between Virginia and Maryland, right? So ultimately, that's the Compromise of 1790. The South gets the national capital, and again, y'all, for people living in South Louisiana, it doesn't think like that. We don't think of Washington, D.C. as part of the South, but especially at that time, it was. Now, there's this issue of we have all of this money, taking on debt, collecting taxes, paying the debt, right? All of this different money stuff. What do we need to deal with that? We need a national bank. We need a national financial institution that's going to handle this. So, with all of the money issues, Hamilton wants a bank that can properly deal with the government's needs. He wanted a national bank. He wanted it to be a private institution with the government being the major stockholder. So he wanted this bank to be set up. That was a private bank, private institution, but the government owned most of it, right? So just like anybody can own a business or anything like that, this was a private entity, but the government was the major owner, okay? So he believed that this bank should be able to print paper money. So he wants the government, he wants to be a private institution with the government being the major stockholder, and this bank would be able to print paper money. Now, where in the Constitution does it tell you that the government has the right to establish a bank? Which article, subsection? Do y'all know? Well, it doesn't. Okay? It doesn't. Hamilton uses that. So it's like, well, if the Constitution doesn't say it, how can you set up? Well, this is where we see things starting to develop. Hamilton said that if the Constitution didn't forbid it, then it's legal. He used the necessary and proper clause, aka implied powers, as his argument. And this is what we would call a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Okay? Let me say that again, y'all. Hamilton said that if the Constitution didn't forbid it, then it was legal. He used the necessary and proper clause. It's also referred to as implied powers, as his argument, and that is what we would call loose interpretation. So what that means, there's a spot in the Constitution where basically it says they knew like they couldn't list out every single thing the government was supposed to do. So they put this little thing in there that said the national government shall do everything that is necessary and proper of a good government. And I'm paraphrasing there, but that's kind of what they're saying. Anything that's necessary and proper for a good government to do, the national government can do. Okay? That's what they say. Okay? We call that the necessary and proper clause. Is also called implied powers. It's implied that the government can kind of do this. Now, again, Hamilton's going to use the argument of, and think about this in your own life. Hey, Mom, can I go to Jimmy's house? I don't know. Go ask your father. Hey, Dad, can I go to Jimmy's house? I don't know. Go ask your mom. Did either one of them tell you no? No. Did either one of them tell you yes? No. But most importantly, neither one of them told you yes, but neither one of them told you no. And so, in your eyes, well, that's a yes, right? Y'all didn't tell me I couldn't go, so I went. Told me to ask the other one. Mom told me to ask Dad. Dad told me to ask Mom. I asked both of y'all. Neither one of y'all told me no, so I went, right? That's the thought process. But there are other people who disagree with that. Thomas Jefferson was against it. Thomas Jefferson has a strict interpretation of the Constitution and said that if it's not directly stated, then it goes to the states, like in the 10th Amendment. So y'all, we actually have here the 10th Amendment and the necessary and proper clause in the actual Constitution that go against each other. Necessary and proper clause says government can do anything that's necessary and proper. The 10th Amendment says if it's not specifically spelled out, then it's reserved for the states, right? So these things are a conflict of interest. So Thomas Jefferson was against it with a strict interpretation, said that if not directly stated, then it goes to the states like in the 10th Amendment. Now, ultimately, Alexander Hamilton is going to win George Washington's confidence in this, and he gets the bank chartered for 20 years in Philadelphia, beginning in 1791. Okay? So Hamilton wins, and y'all understand this. Hamilton and Jefferson are going to butt heads on a lot of these things. They have very opposing views. But Hamilton wins George Washington's confidence, as he often will, and gets the bank chartered for 20 years in Philadelphia in 1791. Now, Hamilton also issued another report called the Report on Manufactures. And this kind of outlines how Hamilton wanted the nation to develop. Are we going to be more farmers? Are we going to be more businessmen? Y'all think about that, right? So the South had a bunch of farmers. The middle colonies were that mix between farming and commerce. And then New England was a bunch of manufacturers and commerce, right? So what are we going to be? Hamilton issues his Report on Manufactures. He wanted to get a nation that had a strong manufacturing economy, that used industry rather than farming as the basis of the nation. He's not saying that farming's bad and all farming we should get rid of all farming. He's not saying that. He just wants us to put more effort into manufacturing and commerce than we do in farming. Now, because of ideas like Hamilton's, the nation's economy will begin to rebound from the post-war times. So again, we had that post-war era under the Articles of Confederation where our economy was not doing well. But nonetheless, under Hamilton's ideas, the nation's economy began to rebound from the post-war times. We started paying the debts back. But many people disagreed with Hamilton's ideas and philosophies. So there's going to be opposition. Well, Hamilton has these ideas, but not everybody agrees with it. Like I said, Jefferson is going to be the biggest opponent of this. So, leading the opposition to Hamilton is going to be Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Okay? So again, leading the opposition to Hamilton is going to be Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. With this opposition, we have the United States' first two political parties. Hamilton will lead the Federalists. That is our first political party, is going to be Hamilton and the Federalists. Opposing him is going to be Jefferson and Madison, who will lead a political party that we call the Democratic Republicans. Eventually, y'all, they will simply take the name they will eventually go by just Republicans, but here they're calling themselves the Democratic Republicans. While Hamilton wanted a manufactured society, Jefferson and Madison wanted one based on agriculture. Okay? So again, while Hamilton wanted a manufactured society, Jefferson and Madison wanted one based on agriculture. Now, if you're writing notes, what I encourage you to do is just take and draw a line in the middle of your page. We'll talk about all the stuff that the Federalists wanted, and we'll talk about all the stuff that the Democratic Republicans wanted. So if you're typing, create 2 columns. If you're writing, just draw a line down the middle, and we'll look at it. So let's look at what these political parties were and what their beliefs are. Okay. So we first look at the Federalists. They're led by Hamilton. They wanted rule by the best people. And y'all, I'm just kind of listing these things in order. So if you want to just make a list real quick, it'll be easy. So the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, they wanted rule by the best people. They wanted a strong federal government, like a strong national government. They wanted a strong navy. They had a loose interpretation of the Constitution. They believed that government should help business. They were pro-British. Most of Hamilton's ideas followed a British model, so they were pro-British. They believed that the national debt was good. They wanted a national bank. And most of them were wealthy, established planters, like they were wealthy, established people, like shippers and manufacturers. Okay, so wealthy, established people, like shippers and manufacturers. Okay, now we move on to the other side, Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison. Okay, they wanted rule by the informed masses, not just the best people, the informed masses, more people being involved. They wanted strong state governments. They wanted a weak navy. Not that they wanted a weak navy as much as they didn't want a navy that could be used to go off and try to conquer the world. They were more focused on America and not conquering it. Remember, these people just fought a war to not be somebody's colony. The Democratic Republicans are saying maybe we shouldn't have colonies ourselves, right? So, led by Jefferson and Madison, rule by the informed masses, strong state government, a weak navy, a strict interpretation of the Constitution. They wanted no favors to business. They were pro-French. They believed the national debt was bad. They wanted state banks. And they were mostly middle-class farmers. They were mostly middle-class and farmers. So we have that. We have our two sides, the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. Now remember this, y'all. Jefferson is a Secretary of State. Hamilton is a Secretary of Treasury. These are two of the closest advisors that George Washington has. The leaders of the two political parties that are developing here are both within George Washington's cabinet. So all of this put a burden on George Washington. He often sided with Alexander Hamilton, but he had to maintain order within his cabinet. He has to maintain this balance. If he just always sides with Hamilton, which he does a lot, is he going to drive Thomas Jefferson away? Again, if somebody asks for your advice and then never listens to you, like they ask for your advice, and then always do the opposite of what you tell them, aren't you going to get to a point in time where you just stop giving advice, where you're going to stop answering the phone for them, all that good stuff? Well, Washington has to kind of make sure he doesn't push Thomas Jefferson away too much. So he has to maintain some order within his cabinet. Okay, so now we move on to the foreign and domestic affairs. So how is the United States handling our issues with other countries and internally here at home under Washington's administration? Okay, so let's look at it. Let's first look at the French, right? The French were the closest thing we had to a friend at the time. So, the French Revolution began in 1789. Remember, I told y'all, the Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world, starts a chain reaction of revolutions. Well, here, the French Revolution starts in 1789. And at first, Americans support it. because the French are getting rid of their monarch just like we did. But if you know anything about the French Revolution, you know it quickly got out of hand. Like, it got out of hand in a hurry, right? Like, it got to the point where they're killing people left and right. So, it quickly went bad with many people being killed. Now, Jefferson supported it as much as possible, but some of the Federalists feared it was going too far. So Jefferson and Democratic Republicans, remember, they are going to be pro-French, are going to support it as much as they can. But there's a lot of killing. So a lot of the Federalists are like, man, look, like, we went to war, but we didn't just have all of these killings and all of this random stuff. So again, remember, the French Revolution begins in 1789, but it gets violent very quickly. And not just like a war of, like, hey, it's us versus the king type war. You see internal conflict and a lot of death and a lot of people being killed. So a lot of people start to question it. But again, Jefferson supports it as much as he can. Jefferson, this is where you talk about, maybe you've heard the quote, the tree of liberty from time to time must be watered, or must be refreshed with the blood of tyrants and stuff like that. That quote kind of comes about because of this. Basically, Jefferson saying, look, we had a revolution and it was a bloody war. This is their version of it. Yeah, maybe theirs is going further than ours did, but we have to support their freedom. We have to support the getting rid of their monarchy. Now, France soon went to war with other nations, like Britain. Remember, Britain and France always kind of hate each other. And that caused problems for the U.S. But why? Why does France and Britain going to war impact us? Remember that Treaty of Alliance that we signed with France during the American Revolution? No, it didn't have an end date. It didn't, it said we'll fight until the war's over and we get a peace. But it didn't say the alliance, that friendship ends. It just kind of said they'll work with us. But it never had an end date, right? Like, that treaty never had an expiration date, if you will. And so, because of the Treaty of Alliance 1778, when France helped us in the American Revolution, but y'all, the United States wants to stay far away from this war. We don't want to get dragged into another war between France and Great Britain. Think about it. They are always fighting. We don't want to be dragged into that. So again, when France decided to help us in the American Revolution, that treaty is kind of now coming back to haunt us. But the U.S. wants to stay far away from this European war. So George Washington is going to issue the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793. Now, both Hamilton and Jefferson like this idea. Yeah, let's remain neutral. But they differ on how it should be carried out. Now, how can we carry neutral? How many different ways are there for us to be neutral? Well, when we look at it, there's being neutral, and there's being neutral where we favor one side. And the way I like to think about this is, if you have a sibling, you've probably questioned mom or dad, or had that idea of, okay, mom, let's be honest, who's your favorite? Who's your favorite child? And they always say, well, I love all of my children equally, right? And they say that. They love all of us equally. Yeah, I have 4 older brothers and an older sister, right? So I love all my children equally. But in their actions, who do they favor? And y'all, if you're the spoiled child, oh yeah, I'm spoiled. Mom and dad give me everything. And if you're the one who feels like you're not spoiled, you're like, yeah, I'm not the favorite. That one over there is. They get everything, right? They get away with everything they do, right? So we see that. And so that's what they're saying, is that Jefferson and Madison both agree, we should declare our neutrality, but we should lean one way. Neutral means we're going to stay here in the middle. But maybe we have a little bit of a lean to it, one side or the other. And that's what Hamilton and Jefferson are going to argue over, okay? So they differ on how that neutrality should be carried out. Which side should we favor? Then comes a guy by the name of Citizen Genet. During the French Revolution, there was this time period where everybody took the title, there's not going to be any kings or queens or any royalties. All of us are going to be citizens. So his name literally is not citizen. His name was Edmond Charles Genet, right? Edmond Charles Genet, right? Well, he has the title citizen. Long story short, we get Citizen Genet. George Washington followed Jefferson's advice and recognized the new French government. Washington says, on Jefferson's advice, new government of France, we recognize you as the legitimate good government. So what do? when a country recognizes you, you send over an ambassador. You send over somebody to represent you in that country. So the French government sent over their representative, Genet, Edmond Charles Genet, aka Citizen Genet. But while he's here, he starts a whole bunch of problems because he goes around trying to recruit people for the French Army and Navy. Well, y'all, does that look real neutral if we have a representative of the French government here in America recruiting people to go fight for France, to go help their Army and Navy? No, it doesn't. So he goes around trying to recruit people for the French military. This upsets George Washington because Washington wants to be neutral. Again, y'all, maybe more than anybody, Washington recognized the struggles of war, and he doesn't want to see the Americans get back into that. So while he is here, he starts problems. Again, Genet starts problems trying to recruit people for the military. This upsets Washington because he wants to stay neutral. Washington was going to deport Genet, but he ended up letting him stay because things were getting crazy in France, and ultimately Genet probably would have been killed. If you know anything about the French Revolution, there's a bunch of little bitty parts, like these people come to power, like they get rid of the king, then these people are in power. Then a few years later, this person. Then a few years later, this person. Then a few years later, right? The French Revolution is very, very rapid in how in its changes. Okay, and so Genet was sent over by one group, but by the time Washington wants him to send him back, the people in power in France then probably would have killed Genet. So Washington lets him stay, but he kind of settles it. He settles it down right there. Okay, like says, look, you can stay, but you're not doing anything. Like, stop going around, stop doing anything. Go sit in a corner and be quiet. That's kind of the mentality Washington takes. So again, Washington was going to deport Genet, but let him stay because it was getting crazy in France, and he probably would have been killed. Okay, and that is where we'll stop for this first video. Chapter 8 will be 2 parts. Will be at least 2 parts, and so we will pick up with part 2 next time.